समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme related documents carefully.
Hello and welcome to The Print. This is Bidisha and you're watching Economics. Pakistan released its economic survey and its federal budget within days of each other this month. Most people read one or the other. I decided to read both. And what they reveal together is far more interesting and far more uncomfortable than what either says alone. The survey says, we are back, we have stabilized, look at these numbers. The budget, if you know exactly where to look, says something rather different. And that gap between what is being celebrated and what is actually happening is what this episode is all about. Part 1: The recovery and why it matters. Let me give you the context first, because without it, the numbers don't really land properly. Between their financial year of 2022 and 2024, Pakistan went through its worst economic emergency since independence. Inflation peaked at 38%, not 8, not 18, 38%. That means the price of everyday goods, flour, cooking oil, fuel, was rising at nearly double digits every few months. The country came within touching distance of a sovereign default, which is the moment a government cannot pay back what it really owes to the international creditors. The state bank's policy rate, the interest rate that governs the cost of borrowing across the entire economy, was raised to 22%. India's at its recent peak was around 6.5. So you get a sense of how extreme the situation was. Pakistan had to go to the IMF and agree to a punishing program of fiscal discipline in exchange of a bailout. Subsidy cuts, tax increases, exchange rate adjustment, very painful stuff. So when the economic survey comes out this year and says GDP growth has recovered to 3.7%, inflation has come down to an average of 6.2%, foreign exchange reserves are at multi-year highs, these matter. I'm not dismissing them. The effort is real. Pakistan has indeed stepped back from the edge. But stepping back from the edge is not the same as moving forward. And that distinction is everything. Part 2: The surplus built on borrowed time. The number the survey is proudest of is what's called the primary surplus. Let me explain what that actually means, because it is one of those terms that sounds more complicated than it actually is. Every government collects money, taxes, fees, and dividends from state enterprises, and every government spends money. Usually, they spend more than they collect. That gap is called the fiscal deficit, and most governments run one. That's absolutely normal. But there is a specific way economists look at this that removes one item from the equation: interest payments on existing debt. Now, why remove it? Because interest payments are not a policy choice. They are an obligation from past borrowing. You borrowed the money years ago. Now you are paying interest on it. That's done. You cannot change it. So the primary surplus asks a cleaner question. Ignoring that interest bill, is the government collecting more than it spends? If yes, that's a primary surplus. Pakistan's for the first 9 months of the financial year 2026 was Pakistan rupee 4,091.5 billion, or 3.2% of GDP. The survey calls this historic. Great, but look at how it was achieved. This figure on your screen is the figure 17 right out of the economic survey. It shows Pakistan's non-tax revenues over the years, money the government earns from sources other than taxes. Profits from state enterprises, fees, dividends, and critically, profits from the central bank. look at that bar for the financial year 2026. It towers over every other year on the chart. That spike is almost entirely one thing. The State Bank of Pakistan transferred Pakistani rupee 2,428 billion in profits to the government this year. Nearly 2.5 trillion rupees from a single source. Now you may ask, why did the State Bank of Pakistan make so much? Because during those crisis years when Pakistan was borrowing at 22% interest rates, the State Bank was also earning very high interest on its own holdings. Crisis earnings, a windfall, by definition not repeatable. And now look at what the budget says. Let's refer to the table 3 from the federal budget document. The State Bank of Pakistan's profit line next year is projected at Pakistani rupee 1,435 billion, down from 2,428. That is a fall of nearly Pakistani rupee 1 trillion in a single non-tax revenue line. Now 1 trillion rupees gone because rates have normalized and the crisis windfall has run its course. Now you may ask, what does this do to the overall picture? The fiscal deficit for the financial year 2026-27 is projected at Pakistani rupees 7,020 billion, wider than last year's revised figure. The primary surplus shrinks from 2.5% of GDP to a projected 2%. The peak of Pakistan's fiscal consolidation has already passed before most people even noticed it had arrived. This is what in economics we call a windfall fiscal effect. A one-off item inflates your numbers temporarily and makes the structural position look better than it is. The danger is when governments or their publics mistake that windfall for something durable and make spending or borrowing decisions on that basis. Pakistan's budget is actually being relatively careful here. But the survey's tone? The survey is celebrating something that is already in the process of unwinding. Part 3. Growing but in the wrong direction. Now let's talk about the growth number itself. Because 3.7% sounds reasonable, but in economics, the composition of growth matters as much as the headline. The table on your screen is directly from the survey and it breaks down Pakistan's GDP growth by sector and asks who is actually doing the work. Agriculture contributed 0.68 percentage points to growth, industry contributed 0.64 percentage points, in services contributed 2.39 percentage points, more than agriculture and industry combined together. Now I want to be careful here because services growth is not inherently bad. Pakistan's digital services, retail and financial sector growing is not a problem in itself. The problem is what it tells you about the underlying structure of the economy. There is a concept in development economics coined by economist Danny Roderick called premature deindustrialization. And it describes exactly what Pakistan is going through. The classic path out of poverty, the one that worked for South Korea, Taiwan, China, and to a significant extent India, runs through manufacturing. You build an industrial base, you employ large numbers of people at wages better than subsistence agriculture, you make things and export them, that earns foreign exchange, that funds schools, hospitals and infrastructure, and over time you move up the value chain into more sophisticated production. What Roderick identified is that many developing countries today are skipping that manufacturing phase entirely, jumping straight into services before the industrial foundation is even in place. And the problem with doing that too early is that services tend to employ fewer people per unit of output than manufacturing does. They tend to benefit educated urban populations more than the rural ones, and they generate far less export earnings. You end up with growth that shows up in the GDP number but doesn't show up in people's lives at the scale you need. Pakistan's investment to GDP ratio is 14.38%. It has been stuck around this level for years. East Asian economies during their high growth decades were investing 30 to 40% of GDP. India, for all its own structural challenges, has been deliberate about its manufacturing push, the production linked incentive schemes, the infrastructure corridors, the active courtship of global supply chains shifting out of China. Pakistan has nothing equivalent with real teeth behind it. Now, the real question is, what does the budget do about this? The total PSDP allocation, the Public Sector Development Program, which is the government's main instrument for capital investment in infrastructure, industry, and human capital, is Pakistani rupee 1000 billion. Identical to last year in nominal terms, which means in real terms, after inflation, it is actually a cut. Meanwhile, and I want you to sit with these numbers for a moment, Defense Affairs and Services is 3011 billion Pakistani rupee, education is 117.7 billion Pakistani rupee, and health is 37.4 billion Pakistani rupee. The defense allocation is roughly 25 times the education budget. It is 80 times the health budget in a country where the survey itself reports education spending at 0.8% of GDP, among the very lowest in the world. These budget numbers are not the allocations of a government that has diagnosed its structural problem and is choosing to address it. Part 4. An economy living off its diaspora. Let's talk about the external account, how Pakistan earns and spends foreign currency, because this is where the structural picture becomes most stark. Pakistan's current account recorded a surplus of $72 million in the first 3 quarters of 2026. A surplus sounds healthy, but look at how it got there. Workers' remittances, money sent home by Pakistanis working abroad, that reached $30.3 billion in that period, up 8.2%. That is a very large number, and it is essentially the entire reason the current account is in surplus. On the trade side of the ledger, the story is exactly the opposite. Merchandise exports declined 5.8% to $23.3 billion. The trade deficit in goods was $27.9 billion. Pakistan is not earning its external position through competitive production. That is very clear. It is being sustained by the labor of millions of people who felt compelled to leave and who send money back to families at home. Now, that is not really a trade strategy. It's more of a coping mechanism. Now, look at this table on your screen. This is table 8.1 from the economic survey, the direction of trade. Look at the China row. In the first 3 quarters of 2026, Pakistan exported $1.9 billion worth of goods to China. It imported $14 billion from China. The bilateral trade deficit with just one partner was $12.1 billion. CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, was supposed to transform Pakistan's productive capacity, and the infrastructure it built is real. Roads, power plants, a deep water port at Gwadar. But infrastructure is not the same as industrial capacity. A road helps you move goods first. You have to make the goods. A decade into CPEC, Pakistan is importing 14 times more from China than it exports to it. That asymmetry is a serious policy failure, and neither the survey nor the budget engages with it honestly. One more number before I close this segment. IT exports grew 19.7% and reached $3.38 billion for July to March. The survey is very proud of this, and genuinely it is positive. Pakistan's tech sector is real and it is growing. But India's IT services sector earns roughly that amount every 2 weeks, every fortnight. I'm not saying that to be dismissive of Pakistan's progress. I'm saying it to give you a sense of the distance between where Pakistan's export economy is today and where it needs to be to anchor the country's long-term external finances. And that distance is not acknowledged anywhere in either document. So let me try and bring all of this together. In macroeconomics, there is a very clear distinction between stabilization and structural transformation. Stabilization is crisis management. You bring inflation down, you rebuild your reserves, you get your deficit under control, you satisfy your creditors. It is necessary, it is hard, and Pakistan has done it. Structural transformation is something else entirely. It is the process by which an economy changes what it actually does, what it produces, how it employs its people, what it exports, how it invests in the generation that is currently in school, and that requires investment rates far above 14%. It requires education spending far above 0.8% of GDP. It requires an export strategy that is not at its core dependent on a diaspora sending money home because there aren't enough decent jobs at home. Pakistan's Economic Survey and Federal Budget 2026-27 read together tell you this. Pakistan has bought itself time. The IMF is satisfied. The worst of the crisis is behind them and the numbers do look better. But neither document tells you what that time will be spent on. And the policies in both suggest the answer for now is not very much that changes the underlying picture. Stabilization without transformation is, in the end, just a slower road to the same destination. Thank you for watching.